Good, then let's begin.
Thank you. We'll start with questions on the phone for media. Operator, over to you.
Thank you, merci. You may press star 1 at this time if you have a question. Vous pouvez appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. La première question de Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. La parole est à vous.
Merci.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. The NDP has asked for an emergency debate today in the House of Commons. Will the Liberal Party agree with that request? You've just promised tangible measures. Could you be a bit more tangible in this announcement? Answer. First of all, I think that all Canadians have been shocked to have seen the news from Kamloops. We can't imagine the fact that there were 215 children taken from their families, and their families hadn't even been told in many cases that their child had passed away. This not only in Kamloops but elsewhere in the country. The reality of residential schools was that children taken from their homes, their families, their culture, their communities, and sent to faraway institutions. When they came back, if they came back, they often had deep trauma, visible and invisible traumas, and many simply never came back, and their families weren't informed as to what had happened to their child. That is part of what we have to recognize, a part of our history, a part of the terrible failures in our relation with Indigenous peoples in this country. That is the reason for which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission put forward recommendations and important measures to recognize the truth and to face the truth as Canadians and to repair and rebuild a respectful relationship based on partnerships, based on sharing this extraordinary territory. And yes, I hope that there will be a debate, including emergency debates, and yes, there will be tangible measures for survivors, for families, and for Indigenous communities. For 6 years now, we have been working hard on reconciliation. There is still a lot to do, and we will continue to do so. Question. When you speak of tangible actions and measures, what do you mean? Is it specifically for that community in Kamloops that was affected? Answer. Well, indeed, we will need tangible measures for those communities. 2 years ago, in our budget, we put money aside to recognize cemeteries associated with residential schools to help this deep trauma experienced by families and communities, intergenerational trauma that continues and that is manifest today in many different ways. Mental health issues, ever-perpetuated cycles of poverty and drug abuse and violence. We have very significant challenges as a country to support and to be here and to give leadership back to Indigenous communities. That is the reason for which, amongst others, we have started a transformational approach of child protective services with Bill 92 that will give communities control over their children so that their children aren't taken away from them when they are in difficult situations. We must trust in that community and work with that community so that children are not taken from their language and their culture. These are measures that we have taken, and of course we will need others, and I know that these past couple of days have been an awakening for many Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, who, yes, were aware that there were residential schools, but didn't quite understand how bad they were, how horrifying the reality was in those residential schools for the children and their communities.
Question, Operator.
The next question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead.
Prime Minister, certain First Nations want federal funding to undertake research and excavation of residential school burial sites across Canada. Will you pay for this?
I think that is an important part of discovering the truth. We have, as I said, already put money forward a few budgets ago on initiatives around residential school cemeteries. There is obviously more to do, and I think there will be more that we will do. We have committed as a government to be there for reconciliation, but also to be there for truth, and that is an important step. So yes, we will be there to work with communities on the things they need and on the things we all need to know.
Follow up, Dylan?
And Prime Minister, advocates say that Ottawa needs to lead a standardized process to ensure that evidence is properly gathered at mass graves, not just cemeteries, instead of leaving that up to a patchwork province approach. Have you tasked any federal departments to start coming up with standards?
I know that Ministers Miller, Minister Bennett, and Minister Van Daal are deeply engaged in this issue, and we are looking for how we can support Indigenous communities in their grief and in their requests for answers. I know there will be many, many discussions to be had in the coming days and weeks about how we can best support these communities and get to the truth. I think the proposal around a standardized approach makes a lot of sense, but of course, we will work with the provinces and territories to make sure that we're all doing the right thing.
Thank you. Next question, operator.
The next question is from Annie Bergeron-Oliver from CTV National News. Please go ahead.
Hi, Prime Minister. Thank you for taking my question. I just want to follow up on what my colleague Dylan said. Will you commit to helping Indigenous communities conduct an examination and investigation of every former residential school site?
We are committed to reconciliation. We are committed to truth. We are committed to being there to help Indigenous communities understand the past and move forward into the future the right way. And as they make requests, as there is a need for discovering more, we will continue to be there. We haven't looked at exactly what the process is or the needs are entirely, but Canada will be there to support Indigenous communities as we discover the extent of this trauma and try to give opportunities for families and communities to heal.
Follow up?
And as my follow-up, yes, you say that there is more to do. What specifically are you talking about when you say there is more for the government to do? And I know you have that meeting today with Minister Bennett and Minister Miller. What are your focus priorities going to be for that meeting on how you can help immediately and in the long term?
Well, what is there more to do on reconciliation? An awful lot. We need to continue to close the socioeconomic gaps within Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. We need to be investing in Indigenous entrepreneurship programs, which we already have, but we need to move forward. We need to make sure there are better schools and better supports for child and family services as we move forward on Bill C-92 last year and are implementing that, but there's still certain work to be done with certain provinces in terms of making that a reality. We need to move forward to do a better job, even on top of Bill 91 that we passed, to recognize Indigenous languages and support those. We need to do more to support residential school survivors and help with the healing process and go at the intergenerational trauma that exists right across the country in Indigenous communities. We need to do more on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls tragedy that it continues to happen in this country. We know there's an important anniversary coming up later this week, and we're going to continue to invest and partner with Indigenous communities and activists to make sure that we are responding and ending this violence that continues to run unchecked in too many parts of the country. We need to continue to work on settling land claims and moving forward on self-government agreements to get out from under the colonial relic that is the Indian Act. We know that it's important that it be done at the pace of the communities themselves, that they be in charge of that process. But we need to be there as full partners as they move towards self-government. We need to continue the work that we've done. We've lifted 107 long-term boil water advisories. There's still more to do. We're going to continue to work on that. There are so many things we need to continue to work on, and we will. This government is committed to reconciliation. We are committed to the truth. We're committed to the partnership that means the solutions will not be dictated from Ottawa, but will be worked on together with Indigenous communities. And I think this is a moment in time, this horrific revelation from Kamloops is something that is striking the hearts of Canadians from coast to coast to coast as what a horrific reality residential schools were. This may not come as a tremendous surprise to many Indigenous Canadians who've long known the horrors and the trauma of loss of brothers and sisters and cousins and children in residential schools. But Canadians may not, non-Indigenous Canadians may not have understood the depth of the trauma for those families, for the family members who survived, for those who came through and watched their schoolmates disappear without a trace. These are the things that Canada is waking up to this week, and it's a difficult and hard awakening, but it is one that we need to take as a responsibility to move forward even stronger on reconciliation.
Merci. Prochaine question, operator.
The next question is from Ryan Tumilty from the National Post. Please go ahead.
Sir, you're talking this morning about work going forward to address this issue, to properly fund the search for mass graves and burial sites. But, you know, that call was made in 2009 with the original TRC report. You know, there's a long-standing history here, and you've been in government for 6 years now. I'm wondering why only now are we discussing a proper search and proper funding to locate these sites?
That's actually not the case. Obviously, this is a further part of the challenges that we're discovering and moving forward on, and there will be more to do. But like I said, in a budget 2 years ago, we talked specifically about this issue and put millions of dollars forward to support the issue of residential school ceremonies and tracing and supporting families. This has been something we have been working very, very hard on over the past 6 years in partnership with Indigenous Canadians. And I think it's an important moment for non-Indigenous Canadians to realize the extent and the need for even more of this important work.
Paul.
Yeah, the funding you're mentioning, I believe, was the $33 million in budget 2019 for a national residential school student death register. I know that work is underway, but it seems like there was also a need to actually do the search. And in the case of the Kamloops discovery, search was funded by the provincial government. I mean, didn't you have a responsibility to act on this sooner than now?
There are many, many different things to act on, and we've, of course, been working with provincial governments, particularly the government of BC, which has been a real leader in reconciliation. And I fear, but also hope that we are going to see similar actions from other governments across the country that will lead to discoveries of even further tragedies. The reality is our focus over these past years has been on healing challenges of the past and supporting people who've been through the trauma, but also on investing in ending boil water advisories and investing in Indigenous entrepreneurship and settling land claims and moving forward on self-government agreements, on moving forward on concrete measures to end gender-based violence and to put an end to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The work that we have done over the past number of years has been concrete and focused on bringing and supporting communities along on their path to success and to moving beyond the Indian Act. But as you point out, Ryan, there are many different things we need to be working on, and we are working on the full range of them, and we will continue to do that with concrete, firm actions that we've taken in the past, but also will take going forward.
Thank you. Next question, operator.
La prochaine question est de Christian Noël, Radio-Canada. La parole est à vous.
Question. Good morning, Prime Minister. Another subject, if I may. The US states that it's ready to rapidly reopen the border, perhaps before July, and to do it unilaterally if need be. Does this pressure from the US government make you uncomfortable? Will you talk about it to Joe Biden at the G7? Answer. I'm looking forward to a good dialogue with President Biden and other leaders at the G7, and I'm sure that COVID and reopening travel internationally will be a subject of discussion. Since the beginning, Canada has made decisions based on the interest of Canadians. But Christian, let us not forget that since the beginning, there has been a certain asymmetry at the American border, as we know. We can't come back to Canada without a rare exception or an essential work to do. But that's not the truth. That's not the reality for America, that has no limits for inbound flights. So Canadians can't travel by land, but they can fly to the States. This was not reciprocal on the Canadian side of things, and so we will work with the United States of America to align our measures as much as possible, but our priority, our absolute priority, will always be the protection of the safety of Canadians. We all want to reopen, of course. We want to come back to normal and travel and see our friends. We want to go on a holiday. We want to travel abroad. But what we don't want to do is have to close again because another wave crashes upon us. And that's why we're so focused on reducing cases throughout the country and vaccination. We have to go beyond 75% of vaccinations with a first dose. We must get as close as possible to 75% of two-dose vaccination, which we will be able to do. We have 3 million vaccines that are coming to the country this week. We know there is still a lot of work to do, but we're on the right track. And we will be making our decisions based on Canadian interests and not based on what other countries would like. Question. The tourism industry. Transborder towns are afraid that unilateral reopening of a border can harm their local economy. Is this a risk you're ready to take? Answer. We have always been conscious of the impact on the economy when we had to take measures, but what we are also learning and what we have seen throughout the year is that places where people have focused too much on protecting the economy and companies and not enough on protecting people's health suffered, but the economy also ended by suffering. The best way for us to ensure a strong economy as we ride the wave and after the pandemic, the way to do that is to control the virus as much as possible. And that is why we are being very, very careful. And provinces in general are opening in a gradual and precautious way in order to ensure, as I said, that yes, there are some companies that would like to open tomorrow, but if opening tomorrow means that we'll have to reclose in 3 weeks, that will be much worse than sticking it out a bit longer before reopening and being able to reopen for good. This is a difficult challenge, but that's the reason for which the federal government has invested so much to help companies, to help workers, to help families, so that these difficult decisions, these difficult economic decisions can be easier to make for provinces. We have been here for Canadians, for workers, and for businesses, especially small businesses, and we will continue to be here.
Take one more question on the phone. Operator?
The next question is from David Aiken from Global News. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Thanks for taking our questions. To come back to the concrete actions that I know you want to take on the 6 calls to action that dealt with missing children and burial information. One call to action, it's not the responsibility of the federal government, but for the other 5, basically, it's all the government of Canada has begun discussions. I wonder, as Prime Minister, if you would insist with your ministers that they end those discussions and actually do something by, within a month, 2 months, 3 months? Can you at least say when any of these calls to action will be completed? When will you tell your ministers to finish and put a check mark beside these calls to action?
If it were only done by ministers, if it were only done by Ottawa to solve these challenges, might have been done long ago, but it would have been done wrong. You cannot move forward on true reconciliation, David, unless it is done in partnership with Indigenous communities, leaders, and individuals. And that's where these discussions that leave us, all of us, Indigenous Canadians, government, reporters, impatient around concrete actions, are so important. It is really important that as we move forward to understand and acknowledge the tragedies of the past, but mostly fix them for the future, that it be done in a way that is not a Band-Aid solution from Ottawa, but that is generated in true partnership, in true reconciliation. And there have been lots of examples of exactly that moving forward. The Child and Family Services legislation we put forward just last year that makes sure that kids who are at risk in Indigenous communities don't get taken from Indigenous communities and put in a provincial system that takes away their language and the culture, as we've seen too often, even over the past few years. That's why we co-developed that legislation with Indigenous peoples. And yes, it took longer to do because we had to work in partnership. But it's incredibly important that we get it right. Now, yes, we have to do these things as quickly as possible. People are impatient. People know that we need to move forward really and concretely on this. But it can't be just Ottawa saying, this is what we need to do. This is how you need to fix it. This is what the money is going to go for. It has to be done in true partnership. And that is one of the big lessons of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I am as impatient as you are to move forward on this, but not so impatient that I'm going to take shortcuts that are going to leave us with missed opportunities and further trauma in the years to come. We are trying to move beyond this challenge together, and that's what we have to do together.
Follow-up, David?
Thank you. And thank you. And of course, that whole missing child and burial information is looking at children of the last generation, perhaps, but there's a whole lot of current children of the current generation, Indigenous children, that the federal government is fighting in some sense, fighting in court against the St. Anne's residential school survivors, fighting in court to overturn a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, fighting in court about Jordan's Principle. And many advocates, Indigenous advocates and everyday Canadians wonder, why is the federal government doing this? It surely has the money to be able to compensate not compensate, but also provide health care for Indigenous children. Why not just drop these lawsuits, write a check as a sign of good faith that Canada is interested in reconciliation?
Well, first of all, David, on Jordan's Principle, before we came to office, not one Jordan's Principle request was approved by the government. Since we came in, hundreds of thousands of Jordan's Principle requests for medical care and services for Indigenous children have been requests. We have made significant movements on that. And in regards to the trauma of the past years that far too many Indigenous young people have gone through, we recognize that. We also, as I've clearly said, know that there needs to be compensation for those young people. That is not what is at question here. The question is, there are many questions, but one of them, for example, is should someone who went to a day school for a few days in a few months or a few year or a year be compensated to the exact same amount that someone who is in a traumatic situation over many, many years where they were taken from their families and had a very, very different experience. Right now, the Human Rights Tribunal says everyone should get exactly the same amount. We don't know that that's entirely fair. We recognize that there are different levels of trauma and some people deserve much more compensation than others. Those are one of the things that we're working very hard with the communities to try and settle, to try and work through. Because it is important that the settlements be fair. Not just fair from an abstract meaning, but fair when you compare the trauma and the horrific experience that one person might have gone through as compared to a lesser trauma that someone else may have gone through. And this is difficult to talk about because trauma is trauma. But I think there is a recognition that there needs to be a thoughtfulness put into making sure that the right compensation is given to everyone. And that is our focus. We have recognized the need to compensate kids who faced this trauma over the past years. That is not the question. The question is, what is the best and fairest way to do that? And on that, we are talking with the communities, with the families, with the advocates to try and figure out the right way forward. I think that's what all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, would expect.
Thank you. And that concludes today's press conference.
Merci tout le monde.